cyber operation can, in fact, lead to trigger, in the case of NATO, Article 5.
Look, just give me a very quick idea about the types of things that a capable military cyber force might try to do and should be able to do.
Well, there are a couple of things. On the most basic level, you may want to get access to a certain computer system or network, and then try and delete data off that system. It can have significant consequences. Think about, for instance, a hospital losing all of its data, and as a result of it, being unable to treat its patients. But you can think about more sophisticated operations as well, such as countries gaining access to another country's power grid or nuclear facilities and try to cause real physical damage.
Okay, and look, recently we talk about this kind of stuff and it would sound very futuristic, but what's happening now? How much of this stuff is happening now? To what extent are, for example, the defenses of nuclear facilities or health services or whatever being constantly probed by state actors right now?
Well, clearly what we see is there is a lot of activity that is mostly in this space still espionage and intelligence collection. So that's first of all. But we have seen indeed a number of cases with real disruptive or destructive effects. Some countries that stand out in this respect are Russia, Iran, North Korea, and actually the US has proven that it is willing to do these kind of operations as well. So to give you a couple of examples, we know from Russia that in 2016, they took just before Christmas, they took down a part of the power grid in Ukraine, and then they did it again in 2017. Now, what's interesting is that often these operations, indeed, you try to probe, but they're not always successful. So similarly, a year later, in 2018, we know of Russia trying to get access to a chlorine station in Ukraine, but then failed to really achieve an effect that they may wanted to do.
So will there be a huge amount of this stuff happening right now with the war in Ukraine?
So the war in Ukraine has been fascinating as a case study, as sad as it of course is. What we have mostly seen in Ukraine, whilst many of us thought we would see these highly disruptive and destructive operations that are very sophisticated, an all-out cyber war, we haven't seen that. But what we have seen in Ukraine are a lot of small tools that are being used to complement the conventional forces. And so this is mostly about wiping data off systems.
Okay, and why do you think it hasn't happened? Has it not happened in Ukraine because Ukraine either has its own or has been gifted fantastic cyber defenses by other nations?
Well, so indeed, Ukraine has done an incredible effort in defending itself and its systems. And part of that is indeed because of the help of nations. But above all, what we have seen is that the private sector really has stepped up. It's a unique case where you see also companies like Microsoft helping the Ukrainian government in defending their systems at the time that was needed. The reason why we haven't seen this, perhaps one is to say, well, there is an early on failure to integrate cyber well with your conventional forces, like Russia has made other operational mistakes. Another reason to say, well, the operational tempo in war is very different than it is in peacetime. You don't want to do these operations that take a long, long time to prepare, but you want to do these smaller operations that you can quickly do, and you can use tools that once you've used them, you can kind of throw them away. So you're using smaller capabilities rather than these larger ones.
When countries aren't at war, what are I hesitate to use the word rules because of course there aren't really rules, but what are the rules? I mean, is it an act of war if another country probes or indeed damages our cyber infrastructure in some way?
Well, so clearly a cyber operation can in fact lead to trigger, in the case of NATO, Article 5, and can you can call it an act of war in case the disruption or destruction is highly significant. What is a bit more tricky, and what we wouldn't call warfare for sure, is indeed when you're just kind of probing these systems, when you're gaining access to them. An open question, though, is, well, okay, maybe what we see is sometimes operations that individually are not very, very significant, but cumulatively can have great effects. And then the question is to what degree you can look at them as a whole and then still say, well, this meets the threshold of seeing this as armed conflict. And increasingly, countries are veering in this direction, that we should think this not individually, but we should look at these operations sometimes in campaign setups where we link them together.
So, look, on some levels, it's a little surprising to think of nations like, well, North Korea and Iran, particularly, having very impressive cyber forces, because we don't necessarily think of them as being, certainly in a civil sense, IT powerhouses. What's the link there? I mean, basically, do we develop fantastic military cyber forces by having a civilian infrastructure sort of there first to provide the manpower and the expertise, or are they quite separate?
Well, what is really interesting here in this space is that it's an uneven playing field. And what do I mean with that? Is countries don't abide by the same exact rules to operate in this space. Some countries care a lot more about collateral effects, about hitting maybe other targets that you don't want to hit, than other countries do. Now, when you think about the number of constraints, so if you want to be a responsible power in this space, then suddenly the requirements to conduct operations disproportionately go up. You suddenly have to do a lot more testing to really make sure that the type of cyber operations that you're conducting is achieving the effect that you wanted to conduct.
So sorry, just to understand what you're saying,
Yes.
saying clearly, basically you mean like, for example, if you're going to, I don't know, if Britain is to probe the defences of Russia, we would be very, very concerned about, for example, taking down a hospital infrastructure by mistake, whereas in return, Russia might be less concerned about doing that to us.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what we have seen in this space. So we've seen, for instance, Russia deploying a worm that affected also many systems in the UK called NotPetya. It started in Ukraine in an accounting firm, but then it had implications for like for shipping companies and many other companies across Europe, because it wasn't really a well-developed capability. And you've seen this with North Korea as well. A well-known case that some will still be familiar with is called WannaCry, where many countries were affected, and the actual benefit that the North Koreans got out of it was really, really limited. That was a ransomware operation. Now, this is something that you wouldn't easily see from many democratic Western countries, where indeed, if you want to conduct an operation, you really want to make sure to say to either your cyber commandos or the public, well, what we have done was a responsible act, and we were certain that we were only targeting these systems and not others.
Sure. Okay. So what do we do in countries like this country in order to boost our cyber forces? How do we set about doing that? Is it about education and building the industry generally? Is it about direct military investment? What are the steps we need to take?
So the UK has already taken a number of great steps in this regard. The first comes, of course, on the defense side, and there are numerous. But you want to make sure that in defending your networks, there is a clear communication channel and information sharing between the government and the private sector. Because ultimately, when we think about securing and protecting our country, when we think about all the networks, most of them are in the private sector. And so you want to create entities and bodies that not just analyze the data that they can find in the case of government, but you also want to make sure that this is properly shared with the private sector. In the UK, has one of the things that they've done very well is set up the NCSC, which is the national body that coordinates much of that. Mm-hmm. But you can also think on the offensive side, where countries have made great developments. In the case of the UK, the latest one is to develop a national cyber force. And what the national cyber force does, it tries to integrate the capabilities of what exists in the intelligence agencies. So this is in the UK, GCHQ, and the Ministry of Defense, and try and integrate these two to make sure that you can effectively operate in this space.
Okay, and what a big sort of international conversations are happening here? Are we, are we working towards having really workable rules like we do about war and conventional warfare? Or is the essentially murky nature of cyber warfare always going to make that difficult?
Well, so what countries are now at the UN level agree on is that international law clearly applies to cyberspace. So, but the question then is, how does it apply? And this is, of course, an open question still today, where countries differ. And you will see different positions taken on this. So, for example, in the case of the UK, it doesn't believe or doesn't say that sovereignty as a principle applies in cyberspace, whereas maybe a country like the Netherlands does believe that. Now, what that entails exactly, we will in some ways still have to figure out in practice, but it certainly suggests that it gives maybe the UK itself a lot more operational room for maneuver. Meaning, if you don't believe that sovereignty as a rule applies in cyberspace, then perhaps gaining access to systems in another country doesn't violate its sovereignty in the same way as conventional forces being in that country as well.
Sure.
So how international law applies is still very much an open question for many.
Look, finally, before I let you go, with society being so sort of digitally reliant these days, is some sort of catastrophic attack inevitable at some point? Should we all have a bag of cash and a tin opener under our beds just in case, or do you think this might be something we can keep putting off?
We will certainly see many significant operations in the future. So that's unfortunately, I think it's hard to completely prevent it. But I wouldn't be afraid that you don't need to store cans of food under your bed. And certainly the more significant attacks, yes, when there is much we can do to prevent some of the most significant cyber operations against us, for sure.
Okay, well, that's heartening in a sense. Thank you very much indeed, Max Smeets. That is Max Smeets, the author of No Shortcuts: Why States Struggle to Develop a Military Cyber Force. Thank you very much.